I'm from Massey University in New Zealand at the moment, but I've only been there for 8 months. I was in the United Kingdom sector before that. And what I want to talk about is some of the work that's going on now as a result of work that was actually funded by the Joint Information Systems Committee in the UK, JISC, and how we're moving that forward. And it's related to repositories, but I didn't actually bribe Frederick to say what he said, but actually the last comment about not using artifacts that are in these repositories is actually where this project started. So the issue about whether or not learning object repositories make e-learning easier is quite interesting, partly because Frederick's already done my job for me. I don't have to worry about definitions of learning objects. We used to go to meetings in those early European projects, and the entire dinner was spent defining what a learning object was, 23 different ways, and there were only ever about 10 people at dinner. But also what we mean by easier. Do we mean easier for the student? Do we mean easier for the member of staff? And my answer would be different to Frederick's. I think the answer is no and possibly yes, as opposed to yours, which was yes and possibly no, I think.
And that was a coincidence.
Yeah. But the challenge for institutional use is where my interest started. It was trying to work out how all the pieces fitted together. It wasn't really a hardware problem. It wasn't really a problem about the quality of the repositories. There were some issues around the software in terms of the metadata that's associated with the objects. But for me, it kept coming back, and maybe it was just a perspective as an academic developer. The perspective was one where it was the human factor, it was the wetware, if you like, rather than the hardware or the software, which was really causing us some problems. We wanted to look at some of these resources and work out how they could be used by people. So there's a whole other question about whether they're well structured and whether in the sort of XML schema sense they are beautifully constructed and interchangeable and can move around systems. And I wanted to know whether anyone was ever going to use any of these beep things. I'll beep myself so you don't have to do it later. So we went back and looked at some of the early work on learning objects around granularity to try and find out whether people actually had gone through a conversational process that we felt we wanted to go through, which was at what point in the process did anybody actually say what the object was constructed for in the first place, and whether there was anything inherent in the objects or in the repositories that talked about whether or not they should be used for this purpose or that purpose. In other words, whether any of the pedagogy had been somehow codified into the objects, or did they just seem to appear as blobs? And we ended up becoming interested in something slightly different. I have notes associated, so I think we'll publish these presentations, is that right? They will go up on the...
I hope so.
Yeah, so all the details are in the notes. I'm going to go relatively quickly because it's quite late. So we ended up with something called the DIAL-E framework, which is basically digital artifacts for learner engagement. I was interested, Fred, you saying about digital artifacts and objects almost as a subset of that, because that's kind of where we came from. And we were being asked to look by the Joint Information Systems Committee in the UK at working with them. It was a tiny little project. It was kind of off the radar. It wasn't one that was put out for tender, as it were. It was a little project to see if we could develop some assisted take-up materials for some digitization projects that were going on. So if we think of these digitization archives of whether it's text or audio or video resources, we think of them as learning object repositories for the purpose of this exercise. We were being asked, how would we go about getting staff to engage with these objects? As Frederick says, the maths teachers look in maths resources, history teachers look in history resources, and they'll go and have a look for something and say, I know what I'm looking for an example of this. They go looking in the repository, they don't necessarily find it, and then they'll either dismiss the repository as not being of any use to them, or they won't necessarily be able to think tangentially about different ways of exploring. So what I wanted to do was to try and find a way, with my colleague Kevin Burden at Hull, of having a conversation with academic staff about how they would go and look for objects. And we wanted to sort of turn this round a little bit, and all the conversations about metadata were deliberately and consciously put slightly to one side. because we didn't really think that staff seemed to split into two camps, those who were obsessed by metadata and those who didn't understand it. So we decided that we would avoid that problem and just not talk about metadata. Instead, what we developed over a period of some months, and I'll show you a better version of this, you don't have to try and read it, so Thomas, is we developed essentially a matrix along two axes. We were interested in the spaces in which you teach, and we were interested in what we're calling learning designs, which essentially are the things which you're actually going to ask learners to do. So these are the doing things that you're going to ask learners to do. So a slightly clearer version of that perhaps would be this, rotated the other way. So here are 10 designs which attempt to explore with learners the kinds of things that they're going to be engaged in. So this is about engagement. And that this is the tool you use to then go to the learning object repository. So we'll take a simple example at the top, simulation. It splits up into 5 different types of stimulation activities that you might use either in a classroom, a lecture theatre, a seminar, or online. It could be in any of those spaces. So for example, let's take video. You would top and tail a piece of video. You're going to introduce it, and you're going to say something after it. That's at its most basic. But you might also do something else. You might, for instance, take the audio off a video and play it at the beginning of a learning session without the sound. And then deliver your learning session, and at the end of the teaching session, play the video again, the same video again, but with sound. Because what you're trying to do is to engage learners at some cognitive level and to think about what it is you want the learner to be doing with these objects. So we went through a process of defining all of these. We got quite carried away. We did a lot more work than we were funded for. A lot of that was producing exemplars, going out and finding resources in some of these databases and describing the kind of things that you would do with them. And the product for GISC, which is publicly available on the web, and the URLs will be in the proper URLs will be in the printed version, is essentially, as you can see, an interactive map of those things, which actually is being populated by its own users. So examples of the particular resources used in particular spaces to do particular things. Right? So this is just an ongoing project. Now the interesting thing from my point of view was that we were interested in how these different designs were going to get individuals, meaning academics, to look differently at a repository resource. So rather than going to a database resource and saying, what do you have on Jean Monnet, because I'm doing some stuff with my students in European studies, you would actually go to the database thinking, I want my learners to be exploring the issue of intercultural dialogue. That's your question. Your question isn't, do you have something on Jean Monnet? It's, I want my learners to be thinking about intercultural dialogue. You don't go to the database thinking, have you got a good example of this particular chemical process? Because you'll be frustrated if you don't find it. You might simply want to go to the database and say, I want students to understand, to be able to analyze a particular energy scenario, so energy exchange scenario. So it's about, if you like, a different level of abstraction when you approach the database. So we built a number of different examples of these deliberately. Some of them will seem a little bit obtuse, I'm sure, and that's actually why I picked them. I could have picked all sorts of things. I deliberately picked slightly more obtuse ones. There's this notion, for instance, that in film, we work a lot with the idea of representations. So you'd say, people in film talk a lot about mise en scène, for instance. But if you wanted literature students to engage with text from an archive, it might be around the whole idea of positioning and structure, about hidden messages, or about cultural assumptions that are being made in the way that literature is presented. So you want to try and get somebody from a different discipline to be thinking about their learning approaches and their learning strategies, not thinking about content. Because once they're thinking about content, their whole approach to the repositories and the archives is different. So in terms of empathy, for instance, as one of our 10 learning designs, we break that down into ideas around getting students to do decision making and role play, And you would define the learning engagement before you identified the resource. And my argument as an educational developer is that you have to do that. You should actually define exactly what you want the learner to do or why. So you define outcomes, you define assessment, you define all of those things, and then you say to yourself, how do I feed that desire, that motivation for the student to engage in that activity? Now clearly you're going to want to do something that's relevant in terms of subject content, but it means that you might settle for something that is slightly not what you would have originally conceived of, because your purpose is the learning engagement. Hey, I'm doing quite well, I've only done 12 minutes. Am I talking really, really quickly? I'll slow down. No, I won't, don't worry. I won't slow down. So one of my favourite examples, which we actually did with a colleague at the university, was he wanted to actually teach students about swarm behaviour. But he knew that if he went to the students and said, look, there's mainstream mathematical formulas for how you actually work with swarms, that the students would go on the web, find some good examples of swarm behaviour illustrated, and immediately start using those to derive the evidence that he wanted them to produce. So instead, he provided them with archive footage of Mussolini crowd performances, gymnastics from Italy in the 1920s, and said, this is the activity I want you to do. I want you to analyse this swarm behaviour. I want you to look at patterns of regularity, difference, and what happens when someone deviates. And they did all of that activity using an archive clip that was nothing to do with the behaviour of animals. But it meant that when they actually came to then analyse some of that footage, they really genuinely understood the underlying concept because they'd done it out of context. Now, it might sound like a contradiction, but he actually found it very, very effective. So we have a framework of these 10 designs, and what we're interested in is the relationship between the object repositories, what I would refer to as content repositories. They make no pretension, if you like, of having all of this metadata necessarily associated with them, but there are enormous numbers of archives, rich media archives, that are very stimulating for students available, both publicly funded in the UK, and JISC funded a lot of those, but there are a lot of free archives, and Beacon and Getty and all sorts of. Then there's the whole issue that's emerging now of actually repositories to share some of these kinds of learning design. So we've begun a process of codifying those designs, and I was very struck by the comment, actually, because I was going to spend 10 minutes talking about it, and you did it for me, which was this idea that there are actually desktop tools which are not necessarily used for the purpose for which they are intended, and quite often the repository tools are not designed very well because they're not designed for a specific purpose. We've taken exactly the opposite view, which is we started by looking at the tools that academic staff already have on their desktops. So we've taken PowerPoint and said, we would like to build into PowerPoint this learning design. Here is the process that you go through to engage a learner. And we'll illustrate it for you at the same time. So using the neat notes field, we're able to basically provide a live example by way of illustration, but also some pedagogic guidance that's written into it. And so here's a PowerPoint presentation that talks to you about how you might get your students to analyse. Here's a PowerPoint presentation about how you might get your students to undertake synthesis. Here's a PowerPoint presentation about how you might get students to provide a kind of collective group knowledge building activity as collaboration. And we provide that to them as a PowerPoint presentation because it's technology that they know, they understand, they probably use it already very badly, and it's on their desktop and they can do something with it straight away. They don't have to go and learn something else. We've done that with Movie Maker. So there's nothing to say that if you had an audio-visual resource, you couldn't actually build that into your framework. So we have, if you like, that some of that pedagogic guidance is built into Movie Maker already. You download it. There's an element that you can obviously just replace, drop your own media archive in, but you can then edit the existing pattern. So what you're doing is picking up an existing learning design pattern and using it in your practice. So we're trying, in a sense, to find ways of getting people to plug into the repository. So they're not just going to a repository and saying, can I find something? And then they have to try and work out how to take it apart. We're giving them, we hope, a framework to go and approach the repository. Now there are some tools which are more customized for this purpose. One of them, which is actually a New Zealand product, which is called the EXE editor, which actually has to be one of the silliest names for a downloadable product, because as you can imagine, the suffix in every case throws out all kinds of wobblies on your system's constantly telling you that there's something wrong because it thinks it's an executable file. But it's actually called EXE, the editor. And what it does, the application's behind. You can see the screen behind. And then this box here is actually the generated example. So it's an XHTML editor, which essentially allows you to produce a mini HTML bundle. So we could call it a learning object if you like, but it's a little HTML editor. It's very, very simple to use. And it allows you to export as an IMS SCORM compliant package or to export it just as a website. Now this is the output, and as you can see, it then generates a whole series of navigational options that has one particular style that's been imposed on it. And it also has the facility, as you can see down the left-hand side, for a number of little widgets, which if you want to do a particular activity, if you want to add a multiple choice questionnaire, you click on multiple choice and it drops that into the environment for editing purposes. What I've done is essentially design, as you can see, there's a list of them down this left-hand side, to actually design those little widgets that relate to the framework so that you drop those into the environment as you build up your own learning object. Now essentially that produces this, and this is an example of one of these. And I would refer to this as a learning object. But the point is that it creates in a single zip folder with a manifest, because it's IMS SCORM compliant, so in that sense you can see exactly what's in it, you can take it apart and reuse it. But the important point for me, is the fact that it's actually has pedagogic guidance built into the environment that you want the academic to work in. Because to just give them an object or to just give them access to a repository doesn't mean they'll do anything very useful with what they get. They might find actually a really fantastic learning object that works perfectly well in its original context, but very rarely is there any kind of professional annotation or marginalia. One of the challenges, which you alluded to, was that whole community building process around objects to allow you to comment and to say, we used it like this, we used it like that, it didn't really work for this context, it would have worked better in this context. And we're saying we're not that precious. We're saying, well, we're going to give you some guidance which you can ignore, actually inside the object itself. So here's a suggestion about how you do this, here's a suggestion about how you do that, if you're trying to achieve these particular outcomes. And the next stages for us are to look at working in LAMs. Some of you will be aware, presumably already, of LAMs. The learning aspect. What we've tried to do with the framework that we've done, much of it has actually been on paper. I'm a closet technologist. I never admit to anyone how much programming knowledge I do or do not have, because it's not what I want to do for a living, and I'm frightened someone will ask me. So the issue for me has been to try and get into an academic conversation with people about how they conceptualize learning for their students, and to then give them support about how they go out and use all this rich media that's available in all of these archives, and a lot of these fantastic learning objects that do exist already in the archives, but which actually they would have to then take apart to get the bits that they really want. If they do that, how do they then put it back together again effectively? And so we've been trying to have that conversation with colleagues. So the work, most of the work that's going on now is happening around those, what we might call pedagogical planners, the tools that are used for designing learning activities. And I'm not making any effort to integrate with any learning object repositories or anything else, but I'm quite happy for anyone to come with a learning object repository output if they wanted to. And we're running quite a few workshops and things on request around that. The project itself does have a website called dialy.net, which is actually just sitting on WebPaint. And for those of you who want to see any of the illustrations, there are some little Blip TV clips that are illustrated. And I'm in New Zealand, but my colleague Kevin Burden is actually based at the University of Hull. And Kevin will do anything for a cup of coffee and a piece of cake. So if anybody actually feels that they'd like to have somebody come and talk to them. I'm quite expensive because obviously I'm in New Zealand, but Kevin's dirt cheap, he'll do anything for a cup of coffee. Thank you.